Good afternoon everyone, my name is Jess Wat. Today on International Women's Day I'm joined by Professor Kim Rubenstein from the ANU College of Law for the latest instalment of Ask an Academic. Thanks Kim for joining us. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you.
That's good. So due to the significance of today, I just want to ask you what you'll be celebrating or what you're reflecting on most.
That's a really good question and appropriate for International Women's Day to be sort of reflecting on the context of it. And of course, in some ways, every day should be international, a day reflecting on the place of all people in society. But I guess the UN framework of international days is a way to focus our attention on significant issues that are relevant to that particular issue. And I guess there are aspects that are about accomplishment and recognising the contributions of women more broadly in all aspects of society, but then having a pause to think, well, how can things be improved? And because there is a great need for improvement in terms of equality and access.
Most definitely. So you've worked a lot on women's empowerment as well, especially with your Trailblazing Women of Law project.
Great.
I just wanted to ask how you got involved with that and how that's coming along.
So I guess the Trailblazing Women in the Law project flows out of a combination of interests that I have. Predominantly it comes from my research and interest on citizenship. So I began doing that from a legal sort of perspective in terms of thinking about how citizenship's within our public law constitutional system, and I've done a lot of work on that, having written a book about it. But in the process of doing that work, I've always reflected on the way citizenship is both a legal status, but also a more normative notion about participation and how different groups within society have access to participation in different ways. And a perfect example is Indigenous Australians as well, in that they've always been citizens, but they haven't actually had access to the rights that flow from citizenship, such as voting rights and freedom even of movement within Australia. And similarly, women have had differentiated rights throughout history, and the vote is another example in terms of at Federation at 1901, women didn't actually have the right to vote, although the women who'd been involved with the Federation movement had been active about trying to use it as a catalyst, and eventually in 1902, white Australian women got the vote, the Indigenous women who actually, some of them had access formally to voting in South Australia, then had it excluded. Anyway, I've always been conscious of these sorts of things in relation to the formal notion of citizenship and the more active notion. And then in addition to that, I've always been interested in biographical endeavours, and one of my long-standing projects, which we might come back to talk to at the end, is writing a biography of the woman who was the principal of the high school that I was at.
Okay, wow.
So, but I've been interested in biography, and then I became aware of a project in America on trailblazing women lawyers, and I realised that there was a real synergy between thinking through what law had given me as a tool for being active in the public sphere, and to reflect more on how women lawyers have conceived of their own citizenship and to what extent they've used law as a frame for active participation. And it fitted in with the National Library's interest in oral history more broadly, and so they became a partner in the linkage grant that led to what you've asked me about.
That sounds amazing. In regards to your own journey as a trailblazing women in law yourself, how have you found that in that journey?
Look, I think it's really been interesting. I grew up in I went to school in an all-girls school, so I think that start for me was quite interesting in a base of an expectation that I could do whatever I wanted to, a framework where women's sort of potential in society was never really questioned, and a principal who had been a student of the school in the 1930s when the first woman principal. So the culture of the school was feminist, although it never was explicitly didn't use that language, but in reflection it was all about women's active participation. And I'd always enjoyed mooting but debating at school, and so in thinking through what I would study, it sort of made sense for my interest in politics and society more broadly. But I also had a historical knowledge of women's access to law, because my grandmother's oldest sister was the first woman who became a QC in Victoria, Joan Rosenau.
Yeah.
So there was a familial connection in a historical sense. None of my family were lawyers, immediate family, but I knew that women could be lawyers, and of course by the time I was at law school we were getting close to women being equal at law school, and then from that position I guess my knowledge of my privilege and my sort of interests in terms of rights led me to really use law in that sort of capacity.
Most definitely. So it sounds like you grew up in a very feminist kind of enlightened environment, would you say?
I think so, in the sense of the schooling in particular. I was quite involved with the Jewish youth movement as well, which was very much about questioning values and ethics and so forth. So I think I've been very conscious about the role of an individual in relation to community, and broadly speaking, that's had a profound influence on me as well.
Most definitely. Moving towards society now,
Yes.
what kind of advice would you give young law students, male or female,
Yes.
in overcoming diversity, overcoming inequality issues?
Yes, yeah. Look, I think it's a really pressing issue. I'm at the moment teaching administrative law to the JD students and really emphasising how we have to be transparent and reflective about where power lies in society. And I think, particularly as a lawyer, we are forced to think about those things in a traditional legal sense, but that we have a responsibility really of thinking about that beyond the formal legal framework. And that law is just one of the tools that can also often, impose power, and how we need to challenge that. And I guess the whole nature of legal thinking and reasoning can encourage us to think beyond the traditional ways of using law. And so in terms of overcoming, disability, or the notion of inequality in society, law can possibly be a tool to assist, but it's not the only tool, and we have to think broadly in terms of other ways to influence public policy to affect change.
Most definitely. And most recently you were also one of the first conveners of the ANU Gender Institute, is
Yes,
that? Yeah.
that's right.
How is coming into that and establishing that at the ANU?
Yes, look, I think the ANU has since 2011 certainly been able to embrace some of these issues from a range of areas. So the Gender Institute is a virtual cross-campus institute, but it has a physical sort of connection through the administrator who sits in the school where the convener at the time sits. So when I was the inaugural convener, the Gender Institute administrator sat just next door here, and so there is a physical connection to it, but ultimately its aim is to connect researchers all around the campus who have an interest in gender issues in their research. But also, what is unique about it is not only research about the broad disciplines that we're interested in, but also research into the university about gender equity at the university. And so today, for instance, this morning at University House, there was a joint sort of HR, Gender Equity and Gender Institute panel looking at gender and culture at ANU. And I think the Gender Institute has been particularly good about linking sort of research that goes outwards as well as research inwards.
And have you felt very supported by the ANU in terms of these kinds of issues?
Well, certainly in terms of setting up the institute and that support that comes from it. In any institution, there are, one step forward, two steps back, and we've had some interesting challenges along the way. But I think the fact that we're still a part of and a significant part of this discourse at ANU is really important. And I was just reminded again this morning about how affirming it is for women from around the campus to come together and hear each other's stories in a way that is very affirming. It's not unlike the Me Too scenario in the sense that part of the feminist mantra is the personal is political, but until you hear the personal stories and hear them in the range of ways that they come out, it's sometimes hard to internalise that. But when you sit in a room like we did this morning and hear 5 different speakers with very different but powerful experiences and messages, it was a really inspiring event.
That sounds wonderful. I'm just shifting gears a little bit, moving towards your interest in citizenship.
Yes.
Last year was obviously a very big year for you. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and also how the citizenship debate, transformed into, say, your teaching?
Great. Okay, so in a range of ways, I think I've been fortunate in that my interest in citizenship has played out in the sort of traditional academic sense in writing a book about Australian citizenship law, but I've also been involved in some of the sort of practical flow-on policy aspects of it. So the Act itself, which was a 1948 Act, was remodelled in 2007, and the process to do that started just soon after I'd published my book on citizenship law, and so I was approached to be a consultant to the department in the redraft of the Act. So I'm able to integrate that experience of how the Act was redrafted. And then in addition, when the government introduced a citizenship test in 2007, with a change of government there was a review of that test, and I was invited to be the sort of lawyer on the independent committee that reviewed the citizenship test.
Right.
So that became another frame of practical interest in the way it operates. And then finally, as a result of my book and the fact that I've kept a practicing certificate throughout, when I finished my law degree and qualified and worked as a lawyer, even when I went into academia, I kept that practicing certificate going, and I've been able to use that to involve students in some cases around citizenship. So last year my admin law students were invited to let me know if they were interested in working with me on the pro bono case of a child who was born in Australia whose parents couldn't get citizenship for her in their country of citizenship, which was Zimbabwe. They actually are now living in South Africa, but this is the nature of the internet. Right. The mother had seen something I'd written on statelessness and the provision, and someone had told her about that provision in Australia, and she contacted me. Wow. And through that email contact and the timing of it, 36 students from your admin law cohort last year joined me, and we ran the case on her behalf, and that child is now an Australian citizen.
That's incredible. Yeah, I definitely heard about that win.
Yes,
I think that's wonderful.
It is. It's a very affirming experience. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time that we had for today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kim. I really appreciate it.